On the cold morning of January 12, 1945, the unmistakable smell of fried chicken filled the air in the city of Aachen. Irmgard Miller, a 37-year-old mother with 3 children, stood completely still at the boundary of the American-controlled part of the city. Her thin body trembled, not only from the winter's bite, but from the unbelievable scene that was unfolding before her. Through the damp, early morning fog, she could see something that should have been impossible. Dozens of German children were gathered in a line at an American field kitchen. Smiling U.S. soldiers were piling their plates high with food. What Irmgard was witnessing went against 12 long years of brainwashing under the Nazi government. Her youngest son, Karl, had snuck out of their home that morning, drawn by the delicious smell that he couldn't resist. Now he was sitting on an overturned box, happily eating what looked like a whole leg of a chicken, something he hadn't touched, or even seen in more than 2 years. Sitting near him was an American soldier, Private First Class James Donahue from the 1st Infantry Division. When the boy finished his first piece, the soldier casually picked up another and dropped it onto his plate. The sheer casualness and abundance of that simple act hit Irmgard with the force of a physical punch. In her own kitchen, she had been trying to make a single potato and a few turnips last for 2 days to feed her family of 5. "Come over here," she whispered to her 2 daughters, who were holding onto her legs for comfort. Their faces, with hollow cheeks and dark, sunken eyes, were a testament to years of rations that had grown smaller and smaller. "Is this some kind of trap?" she thought to herself. She could not make sense of the scene in front of her. It didn't match anything the Reich had told them about the cruel American barbarians who were supposedly starving German civilians to force their surrender. Private Donahue happened to look up and met her gaze. She expected to see hatred or disgust in his eyes, but instead, he smiled. He gave her a friendly wave, gesturing for her to come forward, and then pointed towards the large, steaming pots of food. "Plenty more," he said in his broken German. "Enough for everyone." Those words repeated in her mind. It was a concept so strange it felt like it belonged in a myth. Enough for everyone. She couldn't remember the last time there had been enough of anything in Germany. As Irmgard took her first slow, uncertain steps towards the American field kitchen, she couldn't have known that this exact scene would happen thousands more times all across the occupied territories of Germany. Each time, it would break down another piece of the foundation of lies that the Third Reich had been built upon. What she was about to learn was about more than just food. It was her first direct look at an industrial and agricultural power that made Germany's famous war machine seem like nothing more than a child's toy. In the first few years of the war, German propaganda had worked hard to create a very specific image of the United States. They described it as a nation of weak, spoiled people who were not capable of making real sacrifices or having any military discipline. The Reich's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, had told the German people over and over that America was a paper tiger. He claimed it was economically weak, divided by social problems, and completely unprepared for a real war. "The Americans cannot build ships faster than we can sink them," was one of his most famous statements from 1942. Official news films only showed Americans as one of 2 things: gangsters from Chicago or soft movie stars from Hollywood. There was nothing in between. They were certainly not shown as a nation that could produce a powerful army. This image was created very carefully. During the 1930s, Nazi propaganda had focused heavily on America's economic problems during the Great Depression. They showed pictures of breadlines and shanty towns as proof that capitalism and democracy had failed. Even after America started preparing for war following the attack on Pearl Harbor, German news reports continued to downplay America's industrial strength. They promised the German people that a democracy could never organize itself effectively enough for a total war. By 1943, however, these comfortable lies were becoming harder and harder to believe. Allied bombing raids over German cities were becoming more and more intense. The huge number of American airplanes that filled the German skies was a clear sign of a production ability that went against the official story. Still, for most German civilians, the true scale of America's industrial power was just an idea, something they couldn't fully grasp until they saw it for themselves. Just as Irmgard Muller was about to, the military situation that created this moment had changed very quickly. In the last few months of 1944, after the successful Allied landings in Normandy on June 6th, American, British, and Canadian armies had pushed their way across France, freeing Paris by August 25th. By September, they were at the German border, and in October, Aachen was the first major German city to be captured by the Allies. As the Americans took control of Aachen, they began to use policies that would become their standard practice across all of occupied Germany. Unlike the scorched earth tactics used by the German army in the Soviet Union, or the terrible treatment that the Soviet army would later use in German territories, the American occupation often included practical help for civilians. This wasn't done purely out of kindness. American military commanders knew that a stable civilian population would be less likely to fight back. However, the huge scale of this aid, and the casual way it was given out, would be a complete shock to the German civilians, who had been told that the Americans were coming to starve them. The difference between what she expected and what she was seeing was enormous. By 1944, German civilians were trying to live on official rations that were supposed to provide around 2,500 calories each day. In practice, it was often far less than that as the country's supply lines began to collapse. The average American soldier, on the other hand, was given daily rations that contained over 3,500 calories. On top of that, American field kitchens were known to cook extra food, fully expecting that they would share some of it with local children and the elderly. This huge gap was the result of a fundamental difference in industrial power. In 1944, German factories were desperately trying to keep up production while being constantly bombed from the air. In that same year, the United States produced 200,000 aircraft, 80,000 tanks, and 15 million tons of shipping. American farms were so productive that even after sending millions of their young men off to fight, their total agricultural output actually went up during the war. German agriculture, meanwhile, had been drained of its workers. Women, children, and forced laborers were left trying to keep the farms running as all the able-bodied men had been sent to the front lines. The human cost of this difference was about to become devastatingly clear to Irmgard and millions of other Germans just like her. As Irmgard and her daughters got closer to the field kitchen, she could better see the true scale of the operation. This wasn't just a few soldiers sharing their leftovers. This was a well-organized effort to feed a large number of people. 3 big field stoves were cranking out heat and wonderful smells. Huge pots were bubbling with a thick stew full of meat and vegetables. One soldier was in charge of a deep fryer filled with hot bubbling oil, where he was dropping one piece of flour-dusted chicken after another. A different soldier was working what looked like a portable oven, pulling out trays of freshly baked bread. Staff Sergeant Mike Lombardi, the man in charge of the whole operation, saw Irmgard arrive and walked over to her. "Hungry, ma'am?" he asked, gesturing towards her and her 2 little girls. When she didn't answer, he called over a private who was a German-American to translate for him. "We feed anyone who comes here," the young soldier explained to her in perfect German. "The children eat first, then the mothers, and then the old folks. We're out here every morning at 7 o'clock, but..." "Why?" Irmgard couldn't help but ask the question. "We are your enemy," the translator just shrugged. "Orders," he said. Then he lowered his voice a little. "And besides, most of the guys here have kids of their own back home. We can't just watch children go hungry." What happened next was Irmgard's first real introduction to K-rations, C-rations, and the seemingly bottomless supply chain that kept the American army going. She and her daughters were led to a simple makeshift table. Each of them was handed a tray piled high with scrambled eggs made from powder, reconstituted potatoes, crispy strips of bacon, a thick slice of bread covered in real butter, and a cup of milk. The milk was also made from a powder, but it tasted surprisingly close to the real thing. "Is this what soldiers normally eat?" Irmgard asked the translator as she watched her daughters attack the food with a desperate hunger. "This?" the soldier laughed. "Oh, this is just breakfast. You should hear the things these guys complain about missing from home. Steaks, ice cream, chocolate milkshakes, the very idea of it seemed crazy. Ice cream wasn't a rare treat, but something soldiers just expected to have? Steaks for regular soldiers?" In Germany, meat had become so hard to find that many families were required by the government to raise rabbits for protein, and even that was strictly rationed. For Irmgard, this was only the start of a complete change in her understanding of the world. In the days that followed, she would come back to the field kitchen, eventually bringing other women from her neighborhood with her. Every visit showed her a new side of American abundance that was hard to believe. On her 3rd visit, she watched in shock as Private Donahue casually threw a half-eaten chocolate bar into a garbage can. Without even thinking, she quickly picked it out. Donahue saw her and immediately pressed a brand-new, unopened chocolate bar into her hand. "Take it," he insisted through the translator. "We get way more of these than we can eat." He then reached into a nearby crate and pulled out a handful of a dozen more bars, which were a standard part of American ration packs. For Germans who had been living on ersatz chocolate made from beet sugar and artificial flavors, if they could get it at all, this casual display of plenty was more powerful than any propaganda poster. The chocolate bar itself told a story of American power. The wrapper was colorful and perfectly intact. The aluminum foil inside was clean and undamaged, despite years of war. The chocolate itself was fresh and tasted rich, not like it was missing key ingredients due to shortages. Every part of it spoke of a supply chain that was running with perfect efficiency, even in the middle of a global war. News of the field kitchen spread through Aachen like wildfire. By the end of January, hundreds of German civilians were showing up every morning at American kitchens all over the city. A man named Lieutenant Colonel Werner Hoffmann, who had been an officer in the Wehrmacht and was now working in a non-military role with the American military government, watched this happen with a growing sense of disbelief. "They come here with the mindset of a defeated people, expecting to be given crumbs," he wrote in a letter to his brother, who was in a British prisoner of war camp. "They leave with the unsettling realization that everything we were told about America's capabilities was a complete and utter lie." I watched a supply convoy pull in. There were 97 trucks, stretching out as far as I could see. They weren't carrying ammunition or weapons. They were bringing food, cigarettes, chewing gum, candy, magazines, and phonograph records. This is not an army, Carl. It is a department store on wheels. Lieutenant Colonel Hoffmann's observations were also noted by Dr. Gerhard Meyer, a professor of economics from Aachen University. The American occupation authorities had given him permission to study their logistics system as part of the planning for reconstruction. What he found in his initial research left him in a state of complete professional shock. The American quartermaster system operates on a scale that is impossible to analyze by German standards, he wrote in his journal on February 3, 1945. "Today, I watched them unload the supplies for just one division. The amount of canned goods they brought in was more than the entire Wehrmacht produced in a month, even at our most efficient point. When I asked an American officer if they were concerned about fuel, he laughed. He told me that they lose more gasoline to simple evaporation than many of our fighting units were given in their weekly rations during the last year of the war." For most ordinary Germans, the proof of this incredible abundance came in smaller, more personal ways. Hedwig Schmidt, a 64-year-old grandmother living in Aachen, had managed to save a single pair of silk stockings, which she kept for very special occasions throughout the entire war. One day, she mentioned this to an American nurse at a field hospital where she had brought her sick grandson. The nurse immediately went to her footlocker, opened it, and pulled out 6 brand new pairs, handing them to the stunned old woman. "She gave them to me so casually, as if she were just offering me a drink of water," Hedwig later told the other women at her church. "When I tried to say no to such a generous gift, she just said, 'Please take them. The army gives us more than we could ever use, and I have dozens more.'" Dozens of pairs of silk stockings, in the middle of a world war. For German women who had been drawing lines down the backs of their legs with makeup to make it look like they were wearing stockings for years, this one small act said more about America's industrial power than any military report ever could. The revelations kept coming, often through the most common everyday objects. German children would collect the discarded wrappers from American chewing gum, amazed by the bright colors and high-quality printing, clear proof of a dye industry that was not affected by wartime shortages. Adults were amazed by the Coca-Cola bottles that were everywhere the American army went. Each bottle was perfectly identical to the next, a sign of mass production that could maintain perfect quality even during a global conflict. German mechanics, who were sometimes allowed to help with vehicle repairs under supervision, were shocked by the standardization of parts. Thousands of jeeps, trucks, and tanks all used interchangeable parts, a level of industrial coordination that German manufacturing, despite its reputation for efficiency, had never been able to achieve. The journey from disbelief to acceptance was not a straight line. At first, many Germans were sure that this was all some kind of elaborate trick. They thought that these displays of abundance were just propaganda, designed to have a psychological effect. This suspicion started to fade when they realized that the abundance was simply too widespread, too casual, and too consistent to be a staged performance. Hans Fischer, who had once been a leader in the Hitler Youth and was now working as a translator for the American forces, wrote about his slow disillusionment in a diary that was found many years later. February 10th, 1945, he wrote, "I am still convinced the Americans are just putting on a show for us. No army could possibly keep up these kinds of supply levels all the time." February 15th, the trick continues. Today they got a shipment of fresh oranges, all the way from Florida. In February, the logistics required to make such a delivery in the middle of a war should be impossible. February 28th. I can no longer believe that this is a deception. I have seen their supply depots with my own eyes. I have watched them unload their trucks. What I thought was a wasteful display of luxury is just their normal standard. What the German High Command failed to understand, and what I failed to understand, is that we were not fighting against a country. We were fighting against a continent that has the productive capacity of an entire planet. For many Germans, the most powerful and visceral proof of this unbalanced conflict was the American food. Captain Robert Jackson of the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division wrote in his memoirs about the reaction of a German civilian who was allowed to watch a standard field kitchen in operation. This elderly gentleman, who told me he had been a logistics officer for the Wehrmacht, stood and watched our cooks prepare the evening meal, Jackson wrote. As they opened can after can of meat, vegetables, and fruit, his expression changed from curiosity to disbelief, and then to something that looked almost like horror. When the meal was ready, roast beef, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, peach cobbler for dessert, and coffee with real sugar and powdered milk, he asked if he could sit down. In perfect English, he said to me, "If my superiors had seen just this one meal, prepared in a simple field kitchen for ordinary soldiers, they would have sued for peace back in 1943. For the children, this abundance showed itself in ways that would stay with them and shape their view of the world for the rest of their lives." 10-year-old Dieter Braun, whose father had died fighting on the Eastern Front, started working as an unofficial mascot for an American engineering unit. He would run errands for the soldiers and help them with small tasks. For his work, he was paid with chocolate bars, chewing gum, and sometimes even cans of fruit cocktail. These were items that had become almost like myths in wartime Germany. "The very first time they handed me a can of peaches," Dieter recalled in an oral history interview conducted in 1995. "I ran home to share it with my mother and sister. We hadn't tasted any kind of fruit in such a long time that my sister actually started to cry. My mother immediately asked me where I had stolen it from. She couldn't believe that the Americans would just give such a treasure to a German boy. But then I brought home a chocolate bar the next day and another one the day after that." She slowly began to realize that for the Americans, these things weren't treasures at all. They were just everyday items, so common that they would give them away to the children of their enemy without even thinking about it. As the winter of 1945 turned into spring, the evidence of American abundance was becoming impossible to ignore, and it clashed violently with years of Nazi propaganda. The difference was especially shocking for Germans who had fought on the Eastern Front, where the entire war had been a desperate fight for resources. Major Heinrich Brandt had commanded a tank unit in Russia before he was moved to the Western Front, and captured in early 1945, he described the mental shock of this contrast in a letter he wrote to his wife from a prisoner of war camp in England. "On the Eastern Front, we measured our success by how much food and fuel we captured," he wrote. "We planned entire military operations around the goal of securing supply depots. Our men froze to death and starved, fighting over single loaves of bread and a few liters of gasoline. And then I came face to face with the Americans. In a single day, they throw away more food than my entire company was given in a week. Their supply columns seem to stretch all the way to the horizon. Their individual soldiers carry more ammunition than our whole squads. This was not a war between two armies. It was a war between two economies, and ours was like a child's sandcastle, trying to stop their industrial ocean." This understanding that Germany had completely misjudged not just America's will to fight, but its actual ability to do so, began to spread through all levels of German society in the occupied areas. The evidence was simply becoming too great to deny, and it came in the form of numbers that were difficult to even comprehend. By April of 1945, as American troops pushed further into Germany, the occupation authorities had set up 462 field kitchens. These kitchens were providing extra meals to German civilians in the Western occupied zones, distributing more than 750,000 calories every single day. This food was not being taken from local German farms. It was coming from an unbroken supply chain that stretched all the way back to the heart of America. At the same time, American factories were producing one airplane every 5 minutes, one ship every single day, and one motor vehicle every 45 seconds. A single American car factory, the Detroit Tank Arsenal, was converted to produce tanks. In 1944, that one factory made more tanks than the entire German armaments industry combined. While German production had reached its peak at 19,000 aircraft in 1944 and was already falling due to a lack of materials and constant bombing, American factories produced 96,000 planes in that same year. The statistics were just as staggering for everyday items. America produced 360 million pairs of shoes during the war, and there was never any need to ration footwear for civilians. Meanwhile, German civilians had been limited to one pair of shoes per year since 1942, and by 1945, many were forced to wear wooden clogs or shoes with soles made of paper. Perhaps the most shocking numbers for the Germans who heard them were related to American agriculture. Even though 16 million men had been sent to war, American farms managed to increase their production by 17% between 1940 and 1945. A single American state, Iowa, produced more pork in 1944 than all of the territories occupied by Germany and Europe combined. For Germans who had been raised on the Nazi idea of Lebensraum, the belief that Germany needed to conquer more territory to get enough resources for its people, these numbers suggested that their entire view of the world had been built on a lie. Germany had gone to war in part because it argued it needed more land to feed its population. But here was America, a country that was feeding its own people, its massive military, its allies, and now, more and more, its former enemies as well. The proof of this production gap could be seen in countless small moments all across occupied Germany. In the city of Cologne, American engineering units built a pontoon bridge across the Rhine River in less than 6 hours. German civilians watched this happen in complete silence, stunned because they had been told that a crossing like that would take days to complete, especially under enemy fire. In Frankfurt, crowds of locals would gather to watch American supply units unload 27 freight cars filled with canned goods, cigarettes, and medical supplies, a delivery that was just for one division for a single day. And in the ruins of the city of Dortmund, a 12-year-old boy named Eric Lehman found a discarded combat boot that had belonged to an American soldier. The quality of the leather, the perfect stitching, and the durability of the rubber sole were unlike anything he had ever seen, and the waterproof liner inside it left his father, who had been a shoemaker, completely amazed. For years, he had been forced to produce low-quality footwear with synthetic materials because of the leather shortages. "This is not a boot that was made for a war they expected to be over quickly," the older man said, turning the boot over and over in his hands. "This is a boot made by a country that can afford to supply millions of soldiers for years of fighting, without making any compromises on quality." The most powerful displays of this power came in the form of what the Germans started calling abundance parades. These were the seemingly endless convoys of American supply, trucks that drove through the occupied towns. Unlike the German supply columns, which had become smaller, less frequent, and often pulled by horses as the war dragged on, the American convoys were fully mechanized, completely standardized, and overwhelming in their size and uniformity. Walter Kruger, a city official in Heidelberg, wrote about one of these convoys in his official records. "For 3 hours this morning, we watched an American supply column pass through the main street," he wrote. "I had them counted. There were 638 vehicles. They were all the exact same make and model, all appeared to be in perfect condition, and all were loaded with supplies. They were not carrying weapons or ammunition. They were carrying food, clothing, medicine, spare parts, mail, and what the soldiers called comfort items. At the current production rate of our remaining factories, it would take Germany a full year to produce that many military vehicles. The Americans drove them through our town in a single morning." These displays of logistical power were especially hard for the German military men who saw them. Colonel Otto Wagner, a logistics officer from the Wehrmacht who was now working with the occupation authorities in Munich, was given permission to tour an American supply depot in May of 1945. The report he wrote to his superiors afterwards was brutally honest in its conclusions. "What I have seen cannot be described with normal military words," he wrote. "The American supply system does not even recognize scarcity as a real concept. Where we would carefully count every single bullet, they hand out ammunition by the crate. Where we would painstakingly repair our vehicles until they literally fell to pieces, They replace parts as soon as they show the slightest sign of wear. Their supply catalogs are actual books, thousands of pages long, listing millions of different items, each with its own special procurement code. This is not a military machine. It is an entire industrial society that has been turned towards the goal of war, with all of its incredible productive power still intact. The psychological effect of this material advantage was immense. For Germans who had been told again and again that they were the master race, a people who were uniquely skilled at organization and efficiency, the proof of American superiority in these exact areas forced them to rethink everything they believed. Margaret Schumann, a nurse at a hospital in Stuttgart, wrote about this change in a series of letters to her sister, who was in a part of Germany that had not yet been occupied. April 9, 1945. The Americans have set up a medical station right next to our hospital. Their equipment is arriving every day, not in small bits and pieces like ours did at the end, but in huge quantities that are hard to comprehend. Yesterday, they unloaded 30 X-ray machines. 30. We had been sharing one working machine between 3 different hospitals since January. April 20th. Today, I helped them as they treated German civilians right alongside their own wounded soldiers. They seem to have a limitless supply of medical goods. When I mentioned to one of their doctors that we had been washing and reusing bandages for months, he looked at me with genuine shock. He immediately ordered 3 large cases of sterile bandages to be delivered to our ward. 3 cases containing hundreds of individual packages, and he acted as if this was a completely normal, everyday thing to do. May 2nd. I have to tell you, sister, that everything we were told was a lie. The Americans are not the barbarians that we were led to believe they were. They are not even struggling with shortages, as we were promised all democracies must. They have created a level of abundance here that I cannot even describe to you without sounding as if I have gone mad. Their regular, everyday soldiers are receiving better medical care than our highest-ranking officials did in the final years of the war. I am starting to believe that we did not lose this war because of some betrayal at home, or because we lacked the will to fight, as some people are still claiming. We lost it the very moment that the first American factories began to switch over to war production. For many Germans, this realization was accompanied by a deep sense of shame, not just for the terrible crimes that had been committed in Germany's name, which were only just beginning to be revealed, but for their own foolishness in believing the regime's promises that victory was certain. Rudolf Weber, who had been an enthusiastic Nazi party official in the city of Mannheim and had repeated all the propaganda about American weakness, described his emotional breakdown when he finally saw the truth with his own eyes. I was standing in an American camp for displaced persons in June of 1945, he wrote in his memoir after the war. In front of me were the very people we had worked almost to death. Poles, Russians, French, Belgians. Now they were being cared for by the Americans. In just 6 weeks, many of them had gained 15 kilograms or more. They were given new clothes, regular meals, and medical treatment. An American officer explained their rationing system to me. As he showed me the standardized meals, the vitamin supplements, and the carefully planned balance of nutrients. This is what every single displaced person gets every day, he told me. It doesn't matter what country they are from. The daily calorie count for each person was 3,000. This was more than my own family had been receiving during the last year of the Reich. I had spent years telling people that America was a failed state. I told them its diversity was a weakness and that its democracy was inefficient. In that moment, I saw that their ability to produce was so great that our defeat had been guaranteed from the very beginning. I felt a weight of shame that I cannot put into words, not just for the lies that I had believed, but for the lies that I had spread. This pattern of disillusionment was happening all over Germany, as the truth of American industrial power became too obvious to deny. For civilians who had lived through years of growing hardship, who had been told again and again that their sacrifices would bring them victory, the casual plenty of their conquerors was the final proof that their entire worldview had collapsed. The change was especially easy to see in the children. Emma Schroeder, a schoolteacher in the city of Kassel, kept a professional journal where she wrote down the changes she saw in her students as the American occupation went on. July 3, 1945. The physical change in the children is astonishing. The ones who go to the American feeding stations have all gained weight. Their skin has a healthy color again, and they have much more energy. Today, little Hans, who looked like a skeleton back in April, actually ran around during our physical education time. He proudly showed me a baseball glove that an American soldier had given him. August 12th. The children's drawings have changed in a way that I find both hopeful and a little bit sad. They now draw pictures of American jeeps, tanks, and airplanes instead of our own military machines. Several of them have drawn pictures of American soldiers sharing food or candy. When I asked them to draw a picture of a hero, not a single child drew a German figure. 7 of them drew American soldiers. 4 drew their mothers. The rest drew comic book characters they had seen in American magazines, which have been showing up in the trash bins near the American barracks. September 4th, today, I heard Karl and Friedrich arguing over whether the Americans had always been stronger than Germany. Friedrich was insisting Germany was winning the war until we were betrayed. But Karl, whose family has received a lot of help from the American food program, told him, "My father says we never stood a chance. Just look at their trucks. Look at their shoes. Look at how much food they eat." At just 10 years old, these boys are trying to understand a reality that many of the adults are still trying to deny. This change went beyond just material things. It forced a complete rethinking of ideology. For many Germans, the abundance of America disproved the core ideas of Nazi philosophy, which had claimed that economic strength was linked to racial purity and a government with total authority. The clear success of a multi-ethnic democratic nation went directly against the principles that had been taught to them as the unchangeable laws of history and nature. Johannes Mertens, a former professor of racial theory at the University of Berlin and an early supporter of the National Socialist movement, wrote about his intellectual breakdown in a journal that was found after his suicide in 1947. "I built my entire academic career on the idea that societies with a single, pure race led by a strong central government would always outproduce and outperform diverse democracies," he wrote in August of 1945. "America's performance in this war is the scientific proof that my life's work was wrong. Their productivity goes against every principle I ever taught. Their success proves every prediction I ever made was false. I am now faced with the terrible possibility that I have wasted my entire intellectual life on a fundamental mistake, or even worse, on a deliberate lie." This process of ideological collapse only sped up as Germans got access to real information about the United States. This came through the official occupation media, from talking with American soldiers, and more from letters sent by German prisoners of war who were being held in America. Friedrich Holtz, a private in the Wehrmacht who was captured in North Africa in 1943, sent dozens of letters from his prison camp, Camp Shelby in Mississippi, to his family back in Hanover. At first, he was skeptical about what the Americans were telling him, but his view changed completely during his 2 years as a prisoner. July 7, 1944. "I am still suspicious of how they are treating us here," he wrote in one of his first letters. "The food is plentiful, much better than what we were getting in our own army at the end. We get real coffee, meat every day, and fresh vegetables. I think this might be a special propaganda treatment designed to make us think America is wealthy." December 25, 1944. For Christmas, every prisoner was given a package. It had cigarettes, chocolate, soap, and a small radio. Even our guards got similar packages. I am starting to think that what we are experiencing here is not special treatment at all. By American standards, this is probably completely normal. The implications of that idea are very difficult for me to accept. March 3, 1945. Today, I worked on a farm near the camp as part of a voluntary work program. What I saw there is impossible to describe. The amount of mechanization, the huge size of the fields, the casual way they did everything with such efficiency. One American farmer with his modern machines produces more in a day than an entire German village can using our old methods. The owner was complaining to me that he had a labor shortage because of the war, yet his farm's production has actually gone up. I asked him how that was even possible. "Better tractors," he said, as if that simple answer explained everything. I am starting to think that perhaps it does. June 10, 1945. Now that the war in Europe is over, the censorship on our letters has been lifted. I can finally tell you the truth of what I have learned here. America was nothing like what they told us it was. Their diversity is not a weakness. It is what makes them adaptable. Their democracy is not a chaotic mess. It is remarkably stable. Their sense of individualism does not lead to selfishness. It leads to an incredible amount of innovation. Everything we were taught about them, and by extension, everything we were taught about ourselves and our so-called destiny, was a lie, created to keep the regime in power. I will eventually return to you as a man who has to rebuild his entire understanding of the world from the ground up. Thousands of letters just like this one began arriving in Germany as the mail service was slowly restored. They contributed to what the occupation authorities started to call the Second Defeat, the psychological and ideological collapse of Nazism once it was faced with undeniable proof of its failure. This collapse did not happen to everyone, nor did it happen overnight. There were still pockets of true believers, especially among those who had most strongly accepted the Nazi racial theories, or those who had committed terrible acts that would now be judged as crimes. But for many average Germans, the abundance they saw with their own eyes gave them a way to accept their country's defeat, not as a temporary loss, but as the unavoidable outcome of a fight between two completely unequal systems. Louise Eckhart, who had lost her husband and 2 sons in the war, wrote about this bitter sense of acceptance in a letter to her only surviving son, who was a prisoner in England. "We were not beaten by soldiers with more courage or a better strategy," she wrote in October of 1945. "We were beaten by wheat fields that were too vast for us to even imagine, by factories that were too numerous for our bombers to destroy, and by resources that were so plentiful that they could afford to waste what we were desperately trying to save." She continued, "The Americans I have met here seem genuinely confused about why we fought so hard and for so long. From their point of view, we must have seemed insane to ever think we could win. Perhaps we were." The long-term effects of this encounter with American abundance would last for decades, long after the immediate post-war period. As Germany rebuilt itself under the Marshall Plan, many of the economic and industrial methods that had been seen during the occupation were adopted into the new German economic model. Hans Günther, an economist who would later become one of the main architects of West Germany's economic miracle as an advisor to the government, specifically pointed to his observations of American logistics during the time he worked as a translator for the occupation forces. "What struck me the most was not the sheer quantity of their goods, although that was certainly shocking enough," he recalled in an interview in 1972. "What truly changed my way of thinking was their systematic approach to abundance. The Americans had created standardized methods for producing, packaging, transporting, and distributing goods in amounts that we had been taught were simply impossible. When we started to rebuild Germany, many of us who had seen this with our own eyes tried to adapt those methods for our own recovery. This influence could be seen in Germany's post-war adoption of standardization, industrial efficiency, and eventually a culture of consumerism. The Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle of the 1950s, was built in part on the lessons learned from the American occupation, an ironic outcome of a military defeat that ultimately led to an economic rebirth. On a personal level, the impact of these encounters would be felt for generations. Decades after the war, sociologists found clear differences in attitudes towards America between Germans who had directly experienced the American occupation and those who had not. Those who had seen the American abundance for themselves, especially as children, tended to have more positive feelings about the country, even during later times of political tension. The children who had once stood in line at the American field kitchens grew up to be adults who often embraced American consumer products, management styles, and eventually, a political alliance. Carl Miller, the little boy who Irmgard had watched eating fried chicken on that cold January morning in 1945, eventually moved to the United States in 1961. He became a successful restaurant owner in Chicago. What I remember most was not just the food, although God knows. For a starving child, that was a miracle in itself, he wrote in his memoir, From Aachen to Chicago. What I truly remember was the casual way they shared it. There were no forms to fill out, no ration cards to show, and no questions about my father's political party or his military record. It was just food given freely to a child of the enemy. That single moment held the seed of everything I later came to believe about America, that for all of its faults and its contradictions, it had a generosity of spirit that my own homeland in those dark times had forgotten was even possible. The scene that had so deeply shocked Irmgard Müller on that cold January morning, American soldiers feeding German children, would be repeated countless times, first across occupied Germany and later across much of the post-war world of Western Europe, which was rebuilt through the Marshall Plan. What had started as a simple military tactic to keep civilians calm during the occupation grew into one of the most successful Examples in history of turning former enemies into strong allies. The smell of fried chicken, which had first pulled Irmgard and her children towards the American field kitchen, came to symbolize something much bigger than a simple meal. It was the scent of a completely different way of running a society, an alternative to the mindset of scarcity that had been one of the driving forces behind Germany's decision to go to war. The casual abundance that had seemed so impossible in January of 1945 would, within a single generation, become the normal, expected standard of living for the German people themselves. In 1965, 20 years after that cold January morning in Aachen, Irmgard Müller, who was now a grandmother, stood in her own modern kitchen in the booming industrial heartland of West Germany. She was busy preparing a large Sunday dinner for her family. Her son Karl was visiting from America with his own wife and children. On her kitchen counter were packages of chicken, fresh vegetables, and chocolate for dessert. All of it had been bought without ration cards, and all of it was easily affordable on the salary her son-in-law earned at a local factory. As she cooked, a small transistor radio on her windowsill played music from the American Armed Forces Network. No longer the voice of an occupying army, but the voice of a trusted ally and protector. Outside her window, the economic miracle was in full swing. The streets were filled with German-made cars, and new apartment buildings stood tall where there had once been only rubble. The same abundance that had once looked like evidence of a different world had become her own everyday life. The industrial power that had defeated Germany had, in a strange twist of fate, also been the power that rebuilt it. The simple, casual generosity of a young American private sharing his fried chicken with a hungry German boy had helped to plant the seeds of a transformation that would grow to affect far more than just one family, one city, or even one generation. It was perhaps the greatest irony of the entire conflict that Germany's complete and crushing defeat ultimately brought it a level of wealth and security that was far greater than anything its wartime leaders had ever promised that victory would bring. The path from that field kitchen in Aachen to the economic rebirth of West Germany was not a straight or an easy one. But it all began with that simple, powerful shock of discovery. The realization that the enemy was not the monster they had been told he was, that abundance could be achieved without conquering other nations, and that a simple piece of fried chicken could change not only a hungry child's day, but the very direction of history itself.